Okay, it says that we are streaming live. And so now I just have to have my computer give us our feed. There we are. And grab the link, bring it over to Parlor, and we will be in business. Let's get this going here. Okay, I'll just say live now. Okay, there we are. Excellent. Okay, so thank you for your patience there. Anyone who is either here watching on YouTube or Nadine. I'm watching myself typing a second ago. Okay, so let's not watch that. Let's get back to our Zoom meeting. Welcome, everybody who is watching. I have the fortune and pleasure of speaking this afternoon with Nadine Strossen. And Nadine, if you don't already know who she is the Professor Emerita, the John Marshall Harlan II Professor at New York Law School. And she was also the first woman president of ACLU, which is the kind of position in which I met her so many years ago. I think it was towards the end of your tenure there, because that was from 1991 through 2008. And I was at the Air Force Academy between 2005 and 2008, and you came to speak there, and I really enjoyed your talk. That's what I remember from that time all those years ago. So thank you for agreeing to spend a little bit of time with me today, and welcome.
Oh, it's delightful to be here, Amy. Many, many thanks for hosting me.
Thank you. And so our topic for today is this excellent and very important and more relevant all the time book, which is called, as you see, Hate, and Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. So this is our topic for today. And of course, another time I'm hoping to have a great discussion with her about sort of more political and election-oriented issues. But for now, we are going to focus on this particular book. I came across it because I recently took on a role doing policy for a new social media network called Parler. And in that capacity, I was working on a revision of the community guidelines. And in the old guidelines, we had said some things about hate speech and fighting words. And I was really trying to get clear in my own mind what I thought was important to do in the guidelines. And I ran across, of course, citations to your book because they exist everywhere, brought it up. And our strategic investor and also our chief operating officer, Jeffrey Wernick, he had read your book and highly recommended it. So I went ahead and grabbed it. And then as soon as I dug into it, I said, oh, I really would love to speak with this woman. And of course, I remembered you from before. So that's how I got here. My question for you is, how did you get involved in hate speech? How did you get interested in hate speech? And then we could talk about what it is and what's at stake with hate speech.
As far back as I can remember, Amy, I have been an instinctive defender of free speech, resisting any effort by anybody who had power to silence me, either in terms of what I could express myself or what I was enabled to hear. And I ran into conflicts from the time I was a small kid in public schools. So believe me, when I learned about the First Amendment, when I learned about the American Civil Liberties Union, I was just all primed to go to invoke the organization and the law to support not only my freedom, but that of everybody. And so I've spent most of my adult life defending speech that is controversial, right? If your speech is uncontroversial and if it's popular and if it's supporting the status quo, chances are that nobody is going to try to censor you. So if one defends the principle of free speech, freedom even for the thought that we hate, to quote Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, then one finds oneself over and over and over again, specifically defending free speech principles in the context of speech that is controversial or disliked. Hate speech being a perennial example, so-called pornography being another example, at least in the United States, with our puritanical heritage, extremism or terrorist content being another example, and then last but not least, disinformation or misinformation. Over and over and over again, these are the types of speech that government and others with power, including other social media companies, try to crack down on. So if one truly believes in the neutral principle of freedom for all ideas, no matter how loathed or despised or feared those ideas might be, one has to apply those principles in the context where they are challenged. And let me give you one really specific example of probably the first prominent example of hate speech that I was called upon to defend. And that goes way back to 1977 and 1978, when I was a new law school graduate, already very active in the ACLU as a volunteer lawyer. And the ACLU famously or infamously, depending on your perspective, defended the free speech principle in the context of a group of neo-Nazis who were seeking to march in Skokie, Illinois, a town that not only had a large Jewish population, but also a very high percentage of the Jews in that town were actually Holocaust survivors or closely related to Holocaust survivors. And it was an easy case in the courts of law because the US Supreme Court has said that the bedrock principle underlying all of our complex body of First Amendment law, the bedrock principle is what is usually called viewpoint neutrality or content neutrality. Government may not favor or disfavor speech solely because of disagreement or dislike of its viewpoint, its content, its message, its ideas, no matter how loathed they might be by no matter how large a population, a percentage of the population. That alone is not enough to justify suppressing it. If you dislike the idea, then answer it back, ignore it, counter demonstrate, educate, but don't suppress. So it was an easy case in the courts of law. The ACLU won with one exception, the lowest state court judge in Illinois, which was an elected position, interestingly enough. But the case went all the way up to the US Supreme Court, which summarily affirmed our victory. That means it didn't even hear oral arguments or receive briefs because it was such a slam dunk winner on legal principles. But in the court of public opinion, it was extremely controversial, even among ACLU members. So who is more of a diehard group of free speech supporters than people who spend their money to become card-carrying members of the ACLU? But it was too much even for this group. We lost about 15% of our members nationwide. And that I always like to remind people of that when I hear complaints that, oh, we're facing unprecedented hostility toward hate speech today, or college students are unduly eager to suppress hate speech. This has been a perennial chronic problem throughout history.
Yes. I mean, and people talk about in this particular era that there's so much at stake, and this outcome of this election is going to affect whether this country survives and everything else. And we keep being reminded that those of us who don't have a great knowledge of history are at a great disadvantage in this regard, because all you have to do is look back to the 70s or the 60s, and you can see a lot of controversy, a lot of animosity and division among people. And yet we've had better eras that were not that since. And so we know that we can do it again. But part of it is getting this issue right? I mean, part of being able to ride out these eras of animosity and division is getting the, the method by which we should address hate speech, getting that correct so that
And
we can make progress and move forward. Yes?
And thank you so much for putting it that way, Amy. I agree with so many points that you made, but the last one, when you talked about how we address hate speech, because as the title of my book indicates, I'm not saying we should ignore it. I mean, there's one verb in the title of my book, and that's resist. I want to resist the hateful message. I want to resist discrimination. I want to resist stereotyped thinking. Certainly, I believe I would have had those instincts no matter what. But being the daughter of a Holocaust survivor who had many relatives brutally slaughtered by the Nazis, my own father was a slave laborer in the Buchenwald forced labor camp who nearly died due to the rampant disease. And I only recently discovered that was what I should have known earlier, but my father, like many survivors, did not want to talk about his experiences for understandable psychological reasons. But research that I've done on my own made me realize that the forced labor camps were really death camps too. The Nazis had a deliberate strategy of working people to death. And they called it Zerstörung durch Arbeit. Forgive my bad accent. My father never wanted me to learn German for understandable reasons, but that means to destroy through work. So you would either be killed relatively quickly through gas or relatively slowly through brutal forced labor and horrible conditions. So believe me, if I thought that suppressing hate speech would have prevented the Holocaust or the Nazis' rise to power, I would have been in favor of it. I certainly value life and liberty of human beings in the fullest sense of the word, and would not elevate speech over equality and justice and human dignity. But I'm absolutely convinced from the record, the historical record in Nazi Germany, and the Weimar Republic before that, as well as the current record and record throughout the world and throughout history, that for all of the good intentions that might underlie censorship laws, they actually do more harm than good.
Yes, and that was one question that I did want to get to in terms of the practical effectiveness or the lack of effectiveness of hate speech laws. That was in chapter 7 of your book that I remember the discussion there, and you talking about, your father being a survivor of the Holocaust, which is I mean, I can only imagine. And I can definitely understand why he wouldn't want to talk about it, but it would still have an effect on you. You did mention in that chapter that there were hate speech laws on the books in the time leading up to Hitler's taking of power in Germany, right? And so somehow those did not have an effect of preventing any of this atrocity.
And I don't want to overstate the causal relationship here, but it is really clear that even very strictly suppressive laws that were very strictly enforced was not enough to quell the rise of Nazism. In fact, there were many prosecutions of Nazi publishers and Nazi leaders. Hitler himself served some time in jail and complained about being stifled, and he made that, as did others who were prosecuted, into a propaganda opportunity. The trials became propaganda platforms. They got attention and sympathy they otherwise would not have. They were able to portray themselves as martyrs. And by the way, when they gained power, it was easier somehow for them to suppress speech because it would have been hypocritical for the Social Democrats and others who were also suppressing speech to complain about it. And that's something that worries me a great deal in the current climate, Amy. I consider myself to be a bleeding heart liberal. Actually, the more accurate label is libertarian, because
Mhm.
I'm at least as much a civil libertarian as I am a liberal. But it pains me to see so many liberals and self-described progressives advocate censorship in contexts such as college campuses or social media, where they perceive that the politics are on their side, that it will be anti-progressive views that are the ones that are censored. But the reason why the ACLU has always staunchly defended freedom of speech, even for people whose ideas are completely antithetical to our own civil libertarian ideals, such as Nazis. And in the 30s, we were defending freedom of speech for fascists, whose ideas are also completely contrary to civil libertarian ideals. But to preserve the moral high ground, and both strategically, but also as a matter of moral imperative, to be able to claim the importance of free speech. And it worries me that if the political winds shift, or in certain contexts where, I'm concerned that even from the perspective of progressive values, it seems to me it is strategically unwise to be undermining social and individual commitment to neutral free speech principles, even for the thought that you hate, especially for the thought that you hate.
Right. Definitely. I agree. I mean, that's one of the reasons that I'm doing the job that I'm doing, is to try and create a platform that will offer true freedom of expression, a free and open public square for everyone. And I do hope that we will get as big as our rivals. That is something that we are working on at the moment. We are a smaller scale platform, but we are out there trying to make some noise. Now we've been talking, and we're skipping around a little bit in terms of the order of presentation of your book, but you're talking about one reason that hate speech laws, and also perhaps any sort of a hate speech provision in a set of community guidelines for a social media platform. You're talking about one angle on the reasons why they're wrong, which is the practicality, that they just simply do not work. And that what is going to happen if, for instance, your favored political leaders are not in power, then suddenly you're going to end up being the one who's silenced, and anybody who has a dissenting view and is trying to achieve any improvement in the world is going to be shut down and not be able to communicate. And so that anybody of any viewpoint should embrace the right to express him or herself freely, so that we can continue to try to make the world a better place in our own vision, and count on moral persuasion to do that, right? So that's one. But then in the book, you actually start out talking more about the constitutional principles, really we would say normative principles, that are embodied in our Constitution, that would counter or contradict the whole idea of a hate speech law. And so what are those principles, if you want to just remind people?
Thank you so much, Amy. And I want to make clear that I oppose censoring hate speech beyond the context, the very specific contexts in which US First Amendment law and international human rights law allow particular hate speech in particular facts and circumstances to be punished. And we can come back to that, because it's not a binary, it's not all or nothing. And I think part of the confusion and part of the hostility, frankly, toward free speech is an oversimplification. This assumption that you civil libertarians and you Supreme Court justices, you're defending absolutely all speech and you're elevating it above absolutely all other human rights. That couldn't be further from the truth. So I think it's really important to recognize the very significant and defensible lines that US law and international human rights law draw. But I want to underscore that I support that body of law, because I think it is drawing the appropriate line. I'm not just defending it in the abstract. And if I can just, in a nutshell, summarize the two cardinal principles that sum up a big percentage of this very complex body of law. I've already talked about one of them, the so-called viewpoint neutrality or content neutrality principle. Government may never suppress speech solely because of attitudes, negative attitudes toward the idea that it conveys, the content of the speech. If, however, you get beyond the content and consider the context, then the court has said that in particular facts and circumstances, speech with any content, including a hateful content, may be punished if, but only if, under all of the facts and circumstances, it directly causes or threatens certain specific, serious, imminent harm, posing an emergency. So this is often called the emergency principle. For the lawyers or those who want to learn more about the law who are watching, let me say that sometimes this is discussed through the prism of so-called judicial strict scrutiny. The courts will take a very close look at the speech restriction and will only, it's presumed unconstitutional, but the government could win and the court would uphold a speech restriction if the government bears the heavy burden of showing that the restriction is necessary to promote a countervailing goal of compelling importance. And by necessary, that is interpreted very strictly. So if there is a less restrictive alternative, a less speech restrictive alternative measure that the government could use to protect safety or health or national security, whatever the compelling countervailing goals might be, then the government has to use the less speech restrictive alternative. Speech may be restricted, but only as a last resort. So it's a strict test appropriately, but it is not an impossible test. And in our real world, there are many situations of hateful speech that do satisfy that standard and can and should be punished. So, and the Supreme Court has recognized a number of specific categories of speech that satisfies strict scrutiny, the emergency test. One that could apply to quite a few examples of hate speech is what's called a true threat. And the court uses the term true threat to distinguish it from the very loose way we tend to use the word threat in everyday speech. So I've spoken to college students who have said, I feel threatened when I listen to Donald Trump's speech, or somebody else, because I want to be ideologically diverse here. Somebody else might say, I feel threatened by the fact that Antifa has said that they're going to show up at this protest. That's not enough to suppress either Trump's speech or Antifa's speech. To be punishable as a true threat, the speaker has to be targeting a specific individual or a small group of individuals. And now I'm going to quote the Supreme Court's exact language, has to mean to instill a reasonable fear on the part of the targeted individual or individuals that they will be subject to harm. Now, notice that the speaker doesn't have to intend to actually cause the harm, but the speaker does have to intend to instill a reasonable fear, which is an objective standard, not a subjective standard. So a particularly thin-skinned or fearful individual is not going to be enough to silence the speaker. It has to be a reasonable person. And I can illustrate the distinction between a, very objectionable, repugnant viewpoint, which is not enough to suppress the speech, versus a true threat, which is, by referring to the situation in the well-publicized situation in Charlottesville, in
Mm.
2017. The ACLU, following its long-standing tradition, going back to the founding of the organization exactly 100 years ago, and through the Skokie case, we actually defended the free speech rights of the Unite the Right white supremacist demonstrators in Charlottesville. They had been given a permit to demonstrate in a particular park where the Robert E. Lee statue that they wanted to defend was located. And just several days before the demonstration was going to take place, the city council decided to revoke the permit at the last
Mm.
minute and try to relocate the Unite the Right demonstrators far away from that statue and far away from the center of town. Meanwhile, counter demonstrators who had also been given permits were not relocated.
Wow.
The judge
Yeah.
agreed with us that this was viewpoint discrimination. There was no evidence of any planned violence. There was no evidence of any inability on the part of law enforcement to engage in crowd control and to provide protection for public safety. I think that decision was correct. However, when the facts changed and suddenly you have, masked Unite the Right demonstrators who are gathering and marching with lighted tiki torches that they are brandishing, menacingly toward counter protesters. That to me seems very much like a true threat. I think I'm a reasonable person. If I put myself in the shoes of a counter demonstrator, I would have felt reasonably fearful, and that would have silenced my free speech rights as well as my freedom of movement. So I think our law really does make a great deal of sense. And the danger is if we loosen up. Right now, the emergency standard, the strict scrutiny standard, demands a tight and direct causal connection between the speech and the harm. Now, I fully understand, Amy. I think all of us, rational people, have to understand that speech that doesn't satisfy that standard can be very harmful and hurtful in many ways. We've all
Sure.
experienced it every day of our lives, the power of words to hurt us. But the danger is once you loosen up that connection and give government latitude to punish the speech on a more speculative, indirect connection between the speech and the harm, then all bets are off. That just gives the government so much unfettered discretion that it then has the power to suppress selectively viewpoints that it disfavors, speakers that it disfavors. And that's why before the United States adopted this very speech protective standard in the 1960s, it used a standard that's used in most other countries around the world, which is a so-called bad tendency or harmful
Right.
tendency standard. Any speech that might potentially, indirectly, at some point in the future, lead to some harm can be punished. What speech could not satisfy that standard? So you're
Right.
essentially giving unfettered discretion to whoever is enforcing the law. And therefore, not surprisingly, we've seen that hate speech laws that have that bad tendency standard or just even the viewpoint discriminatory standard are disproportionately enforced against those who are dissenting from government policy, criticizing government officials, seeking reform, and most ironically and tragically, minority groups who are crusading for equality and justice. The very minority groups who are hoped to be helped by these laws, but in
Right.
fact are disproportionately silenced.
Yeah, in fact, you had cited examples in the book of certain leaders of minority groups who have recognized that hate speech laws would not help them. And so, in fact, lobbied against or advocated against hate speech laws because they knew that it was going to be used against them. And in fact, I guess in the Charlottesville example, you saw a little bit of an example of that because today, thankfully, white supremacists are disfavored themselves, right? So,
Absolutely. And you know, something really moving about the Charlottesville situation that's not nearly as known as it should be. Tragically, 4 people died in connection with those demonstrations. 3 law enforcement officials and Heather Heyer, a paralegal who was demonstrating against Unite the Right. And the reason why Heather died and others were injured by the car that was intentionally rammed into them is in part because of the complete absence of law enforcement protection. There was a very critical report that was done in a nonpartisan way at the behest of the city council after these tragic events, done by a law firm, very detailed, but basically it strongly indicted law enforcement at every level, starting with the university police all the way through the FBI, for not having had enough training, preparation, coordination, communication. You know, I don't mean to dump on the brave women and men who are putting their lives on the line to defend all of us. And it's kind of ironic they are subject to criticism for doing too much or for not doing enough.
right,
I know
right.
it's a very, very delicate balance, but um, um, I think that we have to focus on protecting against actual violence, not or even threatened violence, planned violence, but not against ideas that are hateful. So this was the situation in the Weimar Republic, as we were talking about earlier. It was exactly the opposite of what it should have been. There were very strict laws that were strictly enforced against Nazi speech. But the laws against violence went completely unenforced, and the Nazis
Mm,
were literally getting away with murder, murdering communists, murdering socialists, you know, assaulting and murdering Jews and members of other minorities.
right. Yes. So if hate speech laws are both wrong in the sense that they contradict basic principles that thankfully are embedded in our Constitution and in international law, and if they're wrong also because we've seen with this history that they are impractical, that they don't actually address the harms that hate speech is supposed to cause, then what is the right way in your view? You gave a list of different tactics earlier, but I wanted to flesh those out a bit more.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to actually finish one point I started to make in response to your last question,
Mm.
which is an unknown aspect of the Charlottesville situation, because this ties into your current question as well, Amy. I lose track of time, but within the last year or so, I was on a panel about the Charlottesville situation with Susan Rowe, who is the mother of Heather Heyer.
Oh,
And
wow.
uh, she has been crusading full time against hatred and for reconciliation and tolerance and diversity, equality, all of the wonderful values that her daughter gave her life for in the end. And to my amazement, when the moderator, and I still get chills when I think about this, when the moderator of the panel asked Susan Rowe what her position would be if Unite the Right sought to demonstrate again. And you can imagine how I felt as a representative of the ACLU. I think we did the right thing, but I would have understood if she absolutely hated me, hated the ACLU, blamed us for her daughter's death, and you know, used this opportunity to express that. So I was just bowled over by her strong opposition to censorship, her
Oh,
strong support for having the Unite the Right rally not only take place when it did in 2017, but it should take place again. They should not be denied the permit because, and this gets to your question of what do we do? What is
mhm.
a principled and effective way of
Right.
resisting hatred. It is, these people have those ideas. We want to hear them. We don't want them to slink away and plot their violence beneath the radar screen of
No.
law enforcement to monitor them and prevent them from acting on those ideas, or beneath the radar screen of the rest of us to try to dissuade them from their ideas, which has happened in many well-publicized situations, to try to protect other people, prevent other people from being recruited. And I have to say, for all of the research that I did for the book, I became um, I've written about and discussed this issue for decades, as I said
Right.
earlier in the interview. So I certainly had some preconceived ideas, but I tried to the best of my human ability to be open-minded. And if I had seen new evidence based on the enforcement patterns of the proliferating number of hate speech laws in European countries, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, et cetera, if I had been convinced that they really are necessary to promote equality and to prevent hateful discrimination and discriminatory violence, I would have been open to that. But as you indicated earlier, Amy, the evidence to the contrary from human rights activists around the world, I quoted them in my book as well, are
Yes.
saying these laws are at best ineffective and they're at worst counterproductive. So that was, I felt more negative than ever about the hate speech censorship. But I came away infinitely more encouraged about alternative strategies for doing what we need to
Yes.
do, which is, the words themselves are a superficial manifestation of deep-seated attitudes or perhaps other problems. I've been reading so much about what it is that drives people to adopt hate or to espouse hateful ideas, join discriminatory organizations, engage in discriminatory conduct, and what it is that weans them away from those courses. And for better or worse, we now have an interdisciplinary field of hate studies. There is so much
Right.
human knowledge that can be, in so many fields of expertise that can be brought to bear, literally everything from A to Z, or anthropology to zoology, and everything in between. And it's just been really fascinating for me to broaden my range of knowledge by reading it in all of these fields. They all have something to contribute. So what I've mostly been doing as a lawyer and as an advocate is countering hateful and discriminatory ideas, mostly to large audiences. That serves some purpose, especially when you're talking about proactive education. Um, a term that lawyers often use is counter speech, speech that counters the hateful ideas. One thing I don't like about that term is it sounds a little bit too defensive and reactive to me. I think we all, teachers and the rest of us who advocate liberty and justice for all, have an affirmative responsibility to constantly proactively purvey information and undertake actions that will um, uh, promote acceptance of and interaction with and respect for people, no matter who they are. And no, by the way, also no matter what they believe. We're all entitled to fundamental human rights. And I think that all of us as individuals, as well as our democratic republic, are advantaged when we promote mutually respectful engagements and exchanges. Now, focusing though on speech as a vehicle for countering hatred and promoting equality, I was really struck by the number of people who are devotedly engaging, not in large scale kinds of speaking of the sort that I've tended to do, but will engage in very intense, ongoing exchanges with particular individuals who are already enmeshed in hateful organizations or are tempted to become aligned with those organizations. And there's now this whole subgenre of literature, memoirs and narratives, both from the perspective of the person who's doing what they often use the term redeeming the hate monger, and from the perspective of the former hate monger himself or herself. There are TED Talks, there are interviews. I think one of the most famous celebrated examples is Megan Phelps Roper, who was born into the Westboro Baptist Church. Everybody probably knows it since a case went to the Supreme Court. The website of the church is www.godhatesbags.org. Basically, the church's way of interpreting scripture was to pretty much think that God hates everybody except members of the Westboro Baptist Church. Right. And Megan was born and bred into this philosophy and believed it deeply. She lived with an extended family, all of whom were church members. And when she was fairly young and therefore the expert on social media, so she was deployed to go onto Twitter to preach this doctrine of, God hates you if you're not a member of our church. And through that experience, she started exchanging discussions and views of interpretation of the particular Bible verses that underlay her church's philosophy, including with an Orthodox rabbi in Israel. And gradually, not through attacking her, not through castigating her, but through, empathy and respect for her as a person, despite disrespect of her ideas or her particular interpretations, that actually caused her to rethink her own ideas and the ideas she had been brought up with. And through that long process, she ultimately left the church, taking her younger sister with her at enormous personal cost. I mean, this is giving up your entire family. And I'm using Megan as an example, but there are common threads that I've seen in other similar narratives. Another example is a fellow named Christian Picciolini, who's actually written 2 books now and was one of the founders of a group based in Chicago called Life After Hate, that consists of nothing but former hate mongers who are devoting their lives to trying to stop other people from going down that road.
No, that is an extremely powerful story, the power of persuasion to do this. Now, I had a bit of a technical glitch here, which is really interesting. I lost an entire
way of describing it. Some could say it's such a bummer, but you say it's really interesting.
Well, I don't know. I actually, oh gosh, I don't know what's going on here. Oh. Okay, am I still with you?
Yeah, you sure are.
You can hear me. I'm thinking I'm having some weird power failure, of like a partial power failure, because if we're still talking, we must be okay. I don't know. So the sound is not going to be as good right now because I've lost my USB deck. I don't know why. And as long as we're still on, I'll be okay. And you're doing more talking, which I think is wonderful. I don't know if I need to interview you, really. I think you can just.
I don't want to.
And you are anticipating half the questions on my list, which is wonderful. But then I have to keep.
Well, it's all very interrelated, and
no, it is, and that's the whole thing. You even because it is so interrelated, and then I have my own personal angle on it because of the social media thing to try to, logically structure where I want to go with it.
About that, Amy, because my book was written in 2017 and published in 2018, but in just earlier this year, a new paperback edition came out with a long epilogue that focuses specifically on social media, and that went to the publisher in 2019, so it's fairly current. I recently reread it. I still agree with all the points that I made. First, from the constitutional law perspective, I have to tell your viewers something that most people don't know, which is they have no First Amendment rights vis-a-vis social media companies any more than
Right.
they do against any private companies. And most people are shocked to learn that. So in fact, there are constantly lawsuits that are seeking to hold Facebook, Twitter, Google liable for not airing my speech or restricting access to my speech or muting me or kicking me off. And courts have universally dismissed those lawsuits because the Constitution, with one exception, not applicable here, the Constitution only protects you against government conduct, not against anything that's done by any private sector actor, which is not to say that we should not seek other tools to try to protect our free speech rights on these extremely powerful platforms.
Right.
Parler, not yet quite so dominant, but
No, no.
others, for all practical purposes, if you are going to, certainly if you're going to be running for public office, or, if I were still head of the ACLU, I would have to be engaged on these platforms for all practical purposes, because that's where most people are. That is the new public square. In
Right.
2017, the US Supreme Court, in an opinion that had to do with social media, made a really stark statement. It said it used to be debatable what were the most important arenas for free speech, including exchange of ideas and information between the people and their elected representatives. There is no longer any debate. The
Right.
answer now is the online media, and in particular, the social media. So when you put these two facts together, Amy, it's really the worst of both worlds. On the one hand, these companies
Right.
have complete power over, not complete, but extremely great power over
Yes.
free speech, more power than all governments throughout history around the world added up together have exercised, when you consider the scale that we're talking about. I mean, Facebook each month is excising millions of so-called what it deems to be hate speech posts,
Yes.
far more than governments ever have done. And so on the one hand, they have that power. On the other hand, we don't have the check of the Constitution to constrain that power, which means not only don't we have free speech rights as users to receive information, to convey information, but we don't have due process rights to make sure that the rules are being enforced in a fair way, in a transparent way. There's no accountability. I'm very, very, very concerned about this situation. And let me throw one other dimension into it, which I didn't discuss in my epilogue. It's something that I've only learned in the last year since I wrote it. And that is all of the evidence about what's often called surveillance capitalism, about the extraordinarily detailed surveillance of every single keystroke that can put together an unfathomably complex, granular picture of who we are in every aspect, what we believe, what our associations are, what our interests are, what our preferences are, and then algorithmically predict what we're going to do.
Right.
And then when that power is used to determine what information we will get, what communications we will see, what will be elevated, what will be downgraded, to me, that is completely inconsistent with freedom of thought and freedom of speech. Because we are not in, to me, the essence of freedom is individual choice.
Yes.
informed choice and consent. And we're not in any we're not at all consenting to or even aware of the choices that are being made for us by some combination of human content moderators and algorithms.
Okay, so let me ask you a bit of a challenging question then that plays right into exactly what you were talking about. Because I also recently watched The Social Dilemma
I did too.
and have been thinking about these algorithms and how disturbing they are. In fact, I did take some apps off of my phone in reaction to this because the just the surveillance, like you say, and the comprehensiveness of it. And it's not just that they can predict what you're going to do, but it's that they try to manipulate your behavior, increase your engagement. And of course, how do they increase your engagement? They get those things that you react to the most. What are the things that you react to the most? The most extreme ideas, probably. So they have probably fomented a lot of this. And what is then their answer to have these anti-hate speech algorithms whereby they're taking down all sorts of content, probably making it worse if you're right in your book, and I tend to think that you are with all of the examples and the history that you bring to bear here. But one of the things that you talk about in the epilogue is you talk about on Facebook, there were individuals or some groups of individuals who had had success with counter speech of the type that you described earlier,
Mhm.
that the woman from the Westboro Baptist Church had encountered on Twitter. Same sort of thing, but people were doing this on Facebook. And then you talk about an algorithm on YouTube or associated with YouTube called Jigsaw. And
Yeah.
I gather what it could do is it could take people who were already
Yes.
becoming sympathetic to some of these extreme ideas and push them towards what I think you called in here and that everybody calls left tube, right? So, suppose that Google in its infinite, I call it the informational panopticon. And someday we could talk about privacy, because privacy is the thing that I've been talking about and thinking about for
Mhm.
decades. It's a whole nother topic. But
But it's
Google's got that
related.
whole.
Isn't it related, Amy? We've just been talking about that. If you don't
So
have meaningful privacy, then you can't have meaningful freedom of
I've
speech.
got a whole rabbit hole though, Nadine. We don't want to do it now. Serious. But that whole information they could bring to bear and identify you as somebody who is maybe in the process of becoming radicalized, as people like to call it. And then the algorithm would send you down a different path.
I
And
That's problematic. I hope you're going to say
okay,
it's
so you do think it's problematic.
I,
That's my question, right? Because
I do think it's problematic.
okay.
I have to say, as I get headaches when I think about these issues, the social media issues in particular. I find it easier to deal with the old-fashioned, what government power should be and not be, because one of the complexities here is. Not only do the social media companies not, and the other online platforms not have any free speech responsibilities toward us, but they also have their own free speech rights, and I believe they should. I'm not
Right.
anti-capitalist, and these are companies that are engaged in communication, and they do have the right to engage in certain editorial decisions and selections. So it's very problematic. And so I like to start with what I think are simple, relatively simple principles that won't get us very far, but they're certainly better than the lack of protections that we have now. These are procedural type protections. They were endorsed, among other places, in something called the Santa Clara Principles that were adopted in 2018 by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, an excellent organization that focuses
Yes.
on digital rights. The ACLU, Access Now, which is an international organization that focuses on digital rights, and a few individual experts. And it simply calls for transparency,
Mm-hmm.
notice, accountability, some kind of fundamental due process. I mean, let's at least start there. I think that, but where does that lead us in the situation that you're talking about? I believe I would object to, or I would, let me put it this way, I would have serious problems with any unconsented to, let alone completely unnoticed, untransparent
Right.
manipulation of
Yes.
results, even if they happen to be coincidental with my particular values. This is the viewpoint neutrality, content neutrality principle that we talked about earlier. I think that, I can tell you where I'd love to end up, Amy, as somebody who supports free speech for private communications companies, who does support capitalism, and who does want individuals to have as much freedom of choice as possible. In my ideal world, we would have, just a plethora of options in terms of online platforms, and they would offer us just a whole multiplicity of options in terms of content moderation. And that this could mean, many more companies that we can choose among, some of which would market themselves as, we really are the free speech arm of the free
Mhm.
speech movement, which we used to hear from Twitter. Um, and some of which would align themselves with certain substantive values, or other specific kinds of content moderations. Ideally, I would each individual user should be able to choose whatever third-party filtering or moderation they opted for, that could be added to whatever platform they were using. And the term that more technically oriented people use for this is interoperability. That Facebook and Twitter, as well as Parler, should be able to offer their users this add-on, so we could add on, whether it be the Westboro Baptist Church content filtering, or the ACLU
Sure.
content filtering, or the everything goes, or the nothing goes, and everything in between. How do
Well, you
we
know
get
what, Parler, we actually have Parler inbuilt features. We have a mute feature, we have a block feature, and then we also have a feature which is interesting, whereby you can enter a number of keywords that you don't want to hear about at all. So I could put pineapple pizza. I don't want to hear anything about pineapple pizza. And I put that in there, and then I'm not going to get these comments about pineapple pizza. And you can actually decide, tailor what you want to do about it. Do you want to block any user who ever talks about it, etc.? Of course, the danger of some of those tools is, I think, this precise danger that you talk about with respect to hate speech laws, with respect to vagueness, and the danger of them being overbroad or perhaps under enforced. So if you just, go by keywords,
Mhm.
there's going to be some things that are horrible and abhorrent to you that you'll never catch by even by specifying a list of keywords. And you might miss out on a lot of speech that is quite good if you say, I don't want to see anything with this particular word or phrase.
I think we have to recognize that there's no perfect system here, right? Even in choosing books, which I assume, at least in this country, we can read whatever we want and we don't have to read anything we don't want to. It's still impossible to get enough information about what you do want to read, or what it turns out to be a waste of your time. But I'd say that, we're getting closer and closer to the ideal. The more information is available to the individual, the more options the individual has, and the more voluntary control the individual has.
Yes, and that's what we try to do, is we try to put tools into the hands of our individual community members, so each person curates his or her own feed using those tools, and that's what we try to do. The issue of scale, you talk about that you believe the dominant platforms have more of an obligation to follow your advice than smaller ones. And for me, I would say any platform ideally. I mean, I can't even think, why would you want to, for example, suppose you are a believer in the Westboro Baptist Church.
Mhm.
It actually is better for you as a human being to encounter dissenting views.
Mhm.
Because if you end up remaining an adherent, you do so from the standpoint of wisdom, having encountered these counter arguments, et cetera. So I actually can't think of an exception where somebody should want to be in a bubble.
Yeah.
I don't know that your advice applies only to bigger platforms is really what I'm
Well,
saying.
the specific advice that applies only to bigger platforms is putting pressure on them to adhere to international human rights norms as set out in the United Nations Guiding Principles for Business, which was adopted in 2011. And they're voluntary, but even though they're voluntary, the United Nations says, and I understand why, that we're only going to put pressure on or encourage, really large companies that people probably have no choice but to deal with to adhere to these standards. So if you're truly respecting individual freedom for the platforms, you wouldn't even want to subject them to pressure unless they in turn have so much power over individuals. So to me, it's a way of maximizing freedom. And I really care about the freedom of the platforms themselves if they're not so dominant that they can significantly undermine the freedom of the individual users.
Right. Okay. Well, that makes sense. Of course, I think that smaller platforms can also have an international reach these days as
Mhm.
well. And then your advice is normative and not necessarily does it have to be legally binding for it
No,
to be persuasive and something that anybody who runs a platform should listen to.
I think, if you look at the evolution or devolution of content moderation, so-called, on Facebook, Twitter, Google, et al., you see a real um, response not to, in the United States, not to legal pressure, because the First Amendment is a barrier, and who knows, Congress hasn't even tried to regulate these platforms in terms of content moderation. There's some sword rattling, saber rattling now, and there are proposed bills, but for companies that started with no moderation at all and then only slight moderation, they keep increasing. In fact, it's hard to even keep up with. I think in the
Yes.
last week, there have been add-ons about so-called disinformation, misinformation in
Yes.
connection with politicians' statements, even lines in the sand that were drawn, Mark Zuckerberg saying, we're not going to block or even put a negative message on a statement from Donald Trump or any other politician. That has been rescinded
Yes.
in response to enormous public pressure, not in response to any legislation. Likewise, with respect to so-called hate speech, in response to pressure that came from certain civil rights groups this summer, amplified by certain corporations that were engaging in a boycott of Facebook, amplified by Facebook's own employees who staged a walkout, not because of any legal regulation. Facebook increased its suppression of so-called hate speech. So I wish that there were a pro-free speech lobby that had anything close to the persuasive power of the anti-free speech lobby. And I say that with a smile, Amy, because of course I defend people's freedom to pressure for and to advocate for exactly those kinds of restrictions. And I do understand that when you have certain constitutionally protected but offensive, controversial speech, it can have a speech suppressive impact that disproportionately can affect certain people, including minorities and women. I've seen surveys, PEN America, which is a wonderful organization working at the intersection of journalism and free speech, did a survey of its members who are professional writers. And many of them, but disproportionately the females, said they were actually driven off social media by hateful and other obnoxious content that would not violate First Amendment principles. So if you're trying to create an environment where everybody can comfortably express his or her viewpoint, that is a downside of not allowing more content moderation than would be comport with US free speech principles, which is why I prefer to have, that would be one option, but there should be other options that allow more content moderation.
Now we are over an hour speaking right now. I did have two more questions on my list. I know it flies, right? I
Yes,
don't know if you have the time and I could ask the two more questions or not. It's totally up to you.
I'd love
Yes?
to hear them.
Okay, great. Okay. So one of them is about Section 230.
Mhm.
We've had a little bit of an exchange. There's just in the last day or so been a call to completely repeal Section 230 for these dominant platforms, these larger platforms. That is just the latest in a series of proposals that have been made. Do you think that Section 230 should be repealed for anybody, any subset? Should it be amended in a certain way? What are your thoughts?
So for people who might not be familiar with it, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act essentially gives immunity to platforms, both for any third-party content on their platforms and for any content moderation that they engage in. In other words, and that was so essential. I think even its critics acknowledge that the internet would not have taken off. We would not have had the wonderful burgeoning of people who had no option to speak via traditional mass media because of the gatekeeper functions that had to be highly selective. This really allowed the internet to live up to its promise, as the Supreme Court said in the very first case where it upheld free speech online, Reno versus ACLU. I'm so proud of that. The Supreme Court said this allows literally every person in the world to speak to every other person in the world. That would not have happened if the online platforms and other intermediaries would be liable for illegal content that was posted by third parties. And so if they do have that liability, they will have an enormous incentive to overblock, right? To err in favor of keeping too much off rather than face potential liability. And that will make it much more analogous to the old, finite number, very small finite number of broadcast channels or
Right.
newspapers with their op-eds, and would really defeat the benefits of this technology.
So you would not be in favor of repealing, and I assume not even for the dominant platforms, would you be in favor of repealing it at this point?
Absolutely
Okay.
not. And because what would be penalized would be all of us whose voices I'm trying to enhance.
We
And
wouldn't be talking right now, but for
exactly,
230, right?
exactly.
Yes.
And by the way, this means the Section 230 immunizes not only Twitter, but an individual Twitter user who then retweets, right, something. Then they are also, that individual is shielded from liability. So it protects every individual speaker as well as the major platforms. Now, as to particular amendments to Section 230, I know a lot about it, Amy, but I know enough to know that I'm not nearly enough of an expert to opine on that. There are people who spend full time
Yes.
studying
Yes.
the very detailed ramifications. And some people whom I respect have recommended certain very specific, narrow amendments. I don't know enough to know whether those would improve it. I do know that the amendment that has been made so far was predicted to and has had a very speech suppressive impact. That was an amendment that was supposed to protect sex workers, but in fact has harmed them, as well as any kind of expression with sexual content. So I think we have to proceed very, very carefully here.
Yes. And in fact, there are some people, including your fellow potential Supreme Court Justice nominee, Eugene Volokh. I didn't my power here again. I don't know what is going on here, but I think I'm still with you, so I'm very
Yeah,
grateful.
only lost like one word.
This is nuts. Anyway, I did get to speak with Eugene Volokh. You are on a short list with him of Jo Jorgensen's potential Supreme Court nominees were she to actually become president. So
My
that's
husband may vote for her for that reason, he told me.
I mean, I was going to vote for her before that, but of course now, and I, see, of course, why, having spoken to you today, how you would be perfect. And so we can all dream and we can see that one of these two other people is going to win. And that's just how it's going to go. And either way, I don't know what it's going to look like. So that's where we'll talk about politics today. That's it. But Eugene had mentioned that he believes Section 230, even as currently written, already addresses some of the things that the proposed amendments that are out there are supposed to be taking care of. And in particular, he would say, he'd say, yes, Nadine, it's true that part of a company's First Amendment rights, when a company is operating an online website where they invite people to contribute their own content, et cetera, part of their rights would be to be making decisions as to what content they want to display and not, right? The veto power that they exercise. And I would agree that the mere not displaying of something doesn't in and of itself necessarily mean that they should be liable in any way. But if there is something where they are behaving more like a publisher,
Mhm.
or they're doing what some people in these proposed amendments are calling editorializing,
Right.
then they could be potentially held liable for that. Now, I'm reminded by the real world people, and I got a big discussion the other day with someone that practically speaking, nobody would sue to enforce the liability that should exist when, for example, Facebook makes some comment about hydroxychloroquine or something. Like, suppose hydroxychloroquine turns out to be this wonderful cure for COVID, and Facebook's been going around saying, no, we will not allow anybody who says that it's a cure because it's potentially harmful. They're taking a position, and you'd say, okay, well, academically, when we talk about it, they should be held liable. When they actually take an affirmative position, you could say they're being defamatory against these doctors who say otherwise, et cetera. Would those doctors be able to win any particular money? Do they have enough, incentive to actually sue? How would that all work out? I don't know. But Justice Thomas also recently was saying that Section 230, the way that it's written, doesn't say that there's no liability ever for anything that Facebook does or that Twitter does. If they are behaving as a publisher, then they would still have liability for those specific behaviors, right?
I think that's right. Although I have to add that it is very difficult to successfully sue anybody, any speaker, for defamation, especially about matters of public concern. It's very difficult to successfully sue anybody for fraudulent speech. And especially when you're talking about what could, I think, quite plausibly be seen as the expression of an opinion. That can never be the basis of a successful lawsuit for either defamation or fraud, which have to be based on an intentionally or recklessly false statement of fact.
Yes. Yeah. So it would be quite a barrier. And so with respect to, like you say, some of these important issues of the day and what could be more important, other than the election, than the cure for COVID, right? These days, it seems it's going to get us all out of being in our houses. By the way, that's another thing. We're all, captive online. So when you talk about all the surveillance, it's just been amped up completely in these last several months. So the very last question that I had on my list was about this term censorship. There's been a lot of discussion about whether it's appropriate to use the term censorship to apply to what social media companies do, because precisely they are private companies.
Mhm.
Would do you still use that term, and have you been thinking about it all? I discussed it a little bit with Eugene as well.
Yeah, the term censorship is not a legal term of art, Amy. So we tend to use, different people use it differently in
Yes.
everyday speech. If you're literally talking about legally prohibited suppression and you were using the term censorship to refer to that, then it would not apply to what social media are doing. I use the term more loosely, as I think most people do, and to me, it connotes not every suppression of speech, right? Even if government suppress speech based on so-called content neutral time, place, and manner rules, you may not blast a megaphone in the middle of the night in a residential neighborhood. I wouldn't call that censorship. Conversely, if a social media company exercised its admitted First Amendment powers to selectively suppress certain information, as happened very recently with Facebook and Twitter and a certain story in the New York Post, I would call that censorship. To me, it connotes exercising power to selectively suppress ideas or speakers because of disagreement with, disapproval of those ideas, and therefore depriving other people of the opportunity to engage with those ideas or information.
So do you think that some people, when they're using this, and if they're not thinking as precisely as you are about it, the difference between government and other, and they will take the connotation of censorship under which somebody's doing something unlawful, and think that if indeed Facebook is guilty of censorship, that the answer is some sort of government force, some sort of government retaliation. And then here's why we have the calls for the repeal of Section 230. Government should do something because this is censorship.
That's so interesting, because I think you're tapping into a deeper issue, which is if there's any social problem, government's got to do something about it.
Sure,
Or if it's a
sure.
really serious problem, federal government has to do something
Right,
about it.
right.
And that, to me, should not be the first resort. Maybe it should even be the last resort. But that's not to say that we do nothing. And you're doing something through working with an alternative and building up an alternative social media company, and I'm doing something by trying to rally people to agitate against severe content moderation policies. And I think that this is such a delicate area. I would be very, very hesitant to have government come in without an enormous amount of careful study. The congressional hearings that I've participated in have been a lot of rhetoric, a lot of grandstanding, and don't give me a lot of confidence that there is a lot of serious thinking going on. Which is not to say it's not happening behind the scenes, and I do know individual members of Congress who are working very, very hard and consulting a lot of experts, and there are a lot of brilliant experts in law and in technology who, as I say, are focusing on these issues full time and really creatively pursuing steps that wouldn't necessarily include government regulation.
Right. No, exactly. So thank you for what you do with all of this. And you are contributing to the serious thought out there, because again, if anybody wants to, it's still the case that if you put into Google things like hate speech or fighting words, that they will very quickly find you and your book. So you're not being silenced by these big tech people yet. So again, the book is Hate: Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. And the author right here, Nadine Strossen. Thank you so much for giving me again some of your time today, and all of my viewers, thank you as well. I've had this comment from Mark here on YouTube. He says, thank you, Amy and Nadine. So refreshing to hear a thoughtful discussion on one of the most important issues of the day. Wholeheartedly agree. So thank you. I look forward to speaking with you again on different topics and different contexts, maybe someday in person after all this mess is over. And beautiful. We'll talk soon.
Thank you so much, Amy. And I hope you solve your technical problems.
It's still the power is partially out here and I don't know why. It's very interesting. I will look at it. I'm just so glad we didn't get interrupted. Thank you.